The blood was not the problem. I had bled on worse surfaces than the salt-warped planks of the Valdenmere lower quay. I had bled on stone floors and frozen ground, and once, memorably, on the polished marble of my own throne room, when a visiting lord from the northern ridges had underestimated how quickly I moved. The blood was a small thing, a cut along my left side where the dockworker's hook had caught me, not a dockworker's hook in the honest sense, but the weapon of a man who had dressed as one to move contraband through the Ironmere gate. I had stopped 3 of them. The 4th had gotten the hook in before I put him down. What was the problem then? The problem was that I was sitting against the stone wall of a tide house at the 4th hour of morning, in a plain wool coat I kept in a locked chest in the palace stables for exactly this kind of patrol, and I was bleeding in a way that was going to be inconvenient if I tried to walk the 2 miles back to the gates. The cut needed binding. I had nothing to bind it with. My wolf was calm. A wound this small did not alarm him, but he was watching the dark end of the quay with a focused interest I did not understand. I was watching it too when she came around the corner. She was carrying a basket on one arm and a canvas sack over the other shoulder, and she was walking at the deliberate pace of someone who has walked this path so many times that her feet know the route without instruction. She wore a dark gray coat that had been mended at one shoulder, and her hair was pinned back with the kind of efficiency that says, "I do not have time to think about my hair." She was not young in the way of girls just out of their parents' hold, and she was not old. She was the age of someone who has done a thing long enough to be very good at it. She saw me when she was 10 feet away. She did not startle. Her pace shifted, slowed, measured, and she came to a stop at a distance that was neither too close nor dismissively far, and she looked at me the way a person looks at a problem they are considering solving. "You're bleeding," she said. "Yes," I said. "Left side under the coat." "Yes." She set down the canvas sack. From the basket she took a roll of clean linen and a small tin that smelled, when she opened it, of salt and rendered tallow. She crouched in front of me with the ease of someone who has crouched in front of injured people before. "Move your hand," she said. I moved my hand. She peeled the coat back, looked at the cut for 2 full seconds in the way of someone who is assessing and not flinching, and said, "It's a hook. The entry is clean." "You didn't pull away when it caught you." "No," I said. "Most people pull away. That's how hooks tear instead of cut." She was already pressing the salved linen to the wound. Her hands were not gentle in the soft sense, they were steady, which is better. There is a kind of gentleness that is actually timidity dressed in soft clothing, and it is useless when you are bleeding. Her hands were not timid. "Hold still," she said. I held still. She bound the cut with the efficiency of someone who has done this before, not as a healer in a formal sense, but as someone who has found that the world produces more wounded people than there are healers available, and has adapted accordingly. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at me. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes." "Then walk somewhere that isn't this wall," she said. She stood, collected the tin and the remaining linen, and repacked her basket. "The cut needs to be cleaned properly by tonight. Tallow salve will hold it through the day." She picked up her canvas sack, resettled it on her shoulder, and continued up the quay toward the early market. She did not ask my name. She did not wait for my thanks. She did not look back. I sat against the wall for another minute, which is unlike me. I am not, in general, a man who sits. I have been told by several people over the years, my counsel, my wolf master, the woman who raised me after my mother died, a very direct physician from the Southern Territories, that I do not know how to be still. That I am always moving, always scanning, always calculating the distance between myself and whatever needs to be handled next. I have never disputed this. It is accurate. A harbor kingdom does not run itself, and Valdenmere's harbor is the kind of place where the moment you stop watching, Someone is doing something inconvenient with a tied gate or a levy manifest. I sat for another minute. My wolf was still watching the direction she had gone. He was not alert, not watchful in the way of threat assessment. He was, I had no better word for it at the time, attentive. The way a creature is attentive when something has crossed its notice that it has not finished thinking about. I did not know, then, what to make of that. I got up and walked back to the palace. The cut held. She had known what she was doing. Her name was Myra. I did not learn this immediately. I did not go back the next morning. I told myself this was because I had counsel at dawn, which was true, and because the lower key at early market was not a king's business, which was also true, and because there was nothing particular to go back for, which was not true at all, but which I found convincing enough for about 3 days. On the 4th day I had business at the dock registry, a levy dispute that I could have sent my secretary to resolve, but which I chose to attend in person, in the wool coat, because the dock registry is on the lower key, and the early market is also on the lower key, and these two facts were entirely unrelated to one another, or so I was telling myself. The market was setting up when I arrived. It occupied the stretch between the tidehouse wall and the iron crane at the south end of the quay, a packed corridor of stalls selling salt fish and rope and tin goods and the endless variety of things that harbor people need. I found her stall by the smell of the sizing wax she used. It was a small stall, 3 boards across, with bolts of linen and canvas stacked along one side and a narrow work surface along the other where she was already mending something. A coat, from the look of it, the back seam split along most of its length. She looked up when I stopped at her stall. Recognition moved through her eyes, the mild recognition of someone filing away a face they've seen before. "The hook wound," she said. "Healing cleanly," I said. "You were right about the tallow." She nodded and looked back at her work. "Good. You've done that before," I said. "Wound mending." "There are a lot of dock workers," she said, without looking up, "and not enough healers who will come out at the 4th hour. What do you charge?" She glanced up. For the mending, she meant the coat. "For the wound mending." She studied me for a moment with those gray eyes that had the quality I had noticed on the quay. They did not flicker, did not dart to assess whether I was a threat or a patron or a difficulty. They simply looked and recorded and returned to what needed doing. "Nothing," she said. "It was available to be done." This is the kind of answer that stops a man. I have paid in my life for a great many things, and I have been told in a great many different ways that payment was not expected, by people who wanted future favors, by people who wanted me to feel indebted, by people who simply wanted the social pleasure of a king owing them something. The woman in front of me was not doing any of those things. She had mended a wound because it was there to be mended. She was explaining this as a simple fact. "My name is Rowan," I said. She looked up again, this time with a slight adjustment of expression that was not quite a smile. "I know," she said. "And then, I don't mean I know who you are. I mean that you look like a Rowan. It's a name for someone who stands in cold weather without minding it." I did not know what to say to this. I said, "I don't mind cold weather." "I know," she said again. "You weren't shivering. Most people would have been sitting on that wall." She bit off a length of thread. "I'm Myra." "What do you do," I said, "when there are no wounds to mend?" "I do this," she said, meaning the coat, meaning the stall, meaning the bolts of linen and canvas that I was only now observing were arranged by weight and weave, not by color, the ordering of someone who thinks about material properties first and aesthetics not at all. "I mend things. Cloth mostly, occasionally people." I bought a length of canvas I did not need. I told myself this was to avoid standing at her stall doing nothing, which would have looked peculiar. I took the canvas back to the palace and gave it to the stable master, who was puzzled but accepted it without comment because stable masters learn over time that kings sometimes do inexplicable things. I want to tell you about Valdenmere the way I understood it before her, because it matters. Valdenmere is a harbor kingdom, not a sea kingdom. There is a difference. A sea kingdom faces outward, thinks of what is beyond the horizon, orients its whole self toward the open water. Valdenmere faces inward toward the harbor itself, toward the activity of the quays, the movement of cargo and people and information. The sea is there, obviously, one can see it from every high point in the city, but what matters is the harbor, the tidal gates, the levee manifests, the iron cranes and the tidehouse walls, and the smell of salt and rope and tallow that never entirely leaves the lower quarter, no matter how far up the hill you climb. I have been its king for 18 years. My father held it before me and his mother before him, back through the line to the woman who built the first proper tidal gate and made Valdenmere a place worth having rather than a mudflat with aspirations. I know every rope walk and tide shed and registry office in this city. I have walked every quay at every hour. I have done this because I believe, genuinely, that a ruler who only knows the high rooms of his own palace is not a ruler but an administrator of comfortable ignorance. And because, if I am being more honest than is always comfortable, I prefer the docks to the palace. I prefer the smell of rope and salt to the smell of candle wax and floor polish. I prefer people who tell me directly what they need to people who tell me what they think I want to hear. This is why I had been doing the covert patrols. This is why I kept the wool coat in the stable chest. And yet, after 18 years of walking every quay, I had not known Myra was there. She had been there for 11 years, I discovered. 11 years at the same stall, the same 3 boards, the same bolts of linen and canvas in the same arrangement by weight and weave. She had been mending things, cloth and occasionally people, for 11 years on my harbor, 40 feet from the main dock gate, and I had not walked through that particular stretch of the lower quay inn. I tried to remember. It had been years. I always came from the north gate. The south end of the market was 100 feet from my usual route. 100 feet. 11 years. My wolf found this unreasonable. I could feel his opinion on the matter. It was not politely expressed. I went back to the market. Not the next day. I had an Ironmere delegation arriving, which consumed 3 days of council time and left me with a headache that had nothing to do with the wound, which had in fact healed with notable speed. Lord Caston, who controlled the dock levies and had the kind of interest in the Ironmere match that had more to do with his own trading position than with the kingdom's welfare, had arranged the delegation himself. I was aware of this. I had allowed it because Caston had, until recently, been more useful than he was troublesome, and because Valdenmere does real trade with the Ironmere fleet, and I did not want to poison that trade by dismissing the match without consideration. The Ironmere match was a woman called Lady Issen, a composed, practical, entirely suitable person who had the look of someone who had been told since childhood that this particular arrangement was inevitable and had made her peace with it. I respected her. I did not feel in her presence the smallest portion of what I had felt sitting against the wall of the tide house, while a woman in a Mended coat bound my side and told me to hold still. The delegation left on the 4th day, with no commitments made on my end, and with Caston's jaw tight in a way that told me he had been counting on something I had not given him. On the 5th day, I went back to the market. Myra was mending a raincoat. She looked up when I stopped at her stall, and her expression did this thing I was beginning to recognize: a slight adjustment, a quick registration, a return to neutral that was not unfriendly but that did not go looking for interaction. "Rowan," she said. "Myra," I said. "No wound today," she observed. "No wound today." She went back to the raincoat. I stood at the edge of her stall and watched her work, which I understood was unusual behavior and which I could not stop doing. There was something in the way she worked that I could not leave alone, the economy of it, the absence of wasted motion, every stitch placed where it needed to go and nowhere else. I have in my life watched a great many craftspeople work, the rope walkers of the North Quay, the iron casters of the crane yard, the pilots who bring the deep draft vessels through the tidal gates, and there is something that happens when someone has done a thing long enough that the motion has become native to them, that the tool is an extension of thought rather than an instrument of it. Myra had that. She was not thinking about the stitch. She was thinking about the next stitch, and the one after, the whole coat already mapped in her mind. "You keep coming back," she said without looking up. "Yes," I said. "Why?" I had a number of answers that were technically true, that I had business at the registry, that I preferred the lower key to the upper, that I liked the market. None of them were the actual reason. "I find it difficult to be elsewhere," I said. She looked up. Those gray eyes looked at me for a measured moment. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I try," I said. She returned to the coat. "You can stay if you don't get in the way of customers." I stayed. No customers came for 20 minutes. It was a slow morning, and I stood at the edge of the stall and watched her work, and my wolf, who had been restless for days, went quiet. Not the quiet of sleeping, not the quiet of being bored, the quiet of something satisfied. I had not felt that quiet I could not remember when I had felt it. There is a specific stillness that comes at slack tide, when the water in the harbor stops moving in either direction before the current reverses. Sailors call it the dead point. It lasts only minutes. In those minutes the harbor is absolutely still, and if you are near the water you can feel it, a suspension, a held breath, the world pausing between one motion and the next. My wolf had gone still the way the harbor goes still at slack tide. I could not explain it. I went to find explanation where I always found it. I went to Aldrich. Aldrich was my wolf master, which is a title that sounds grander than the job usually is. A wolf master in a harbor kingdom spends most of his time managing the pack's relationship with the docks, keeping the wolves from eating the Ironmere agent's cats, mediating the occasional dispute between a harbor wolf and a dock crane's grinding gears, explaining to visiting delegation members why the large gray animal sitting on their luggage had opinions about who could touch it. Aldrich had held this post for 30 years. He was 70 years old, small, and had survived this long by the method of watching everything very carefully and saying most of what he saw to no one. I found him in the wolf yard, which occupied the lower section of the palace grounds and smelled of straw and clean fur and the specific mineral smell of wolves. He was sitting on an upturned crate watching a young female pace the perimeter of the yard with the self-important purposefulness of a young wolf who has not yet learned that the perimeter will not become more interesting no matter how many times she checks it. I sat down on an adjacent crate and told him what had happened. Not all of it. I told him that my wolf had gone quiet, the slack-tide quality of it, in the presence of a woman I had met on the quays, and that I did not know what to make of it. Aldrich watched the young wolf pace. He said nothing for 30 seconds, which was normal. Aldrich processed things at the pace of a man who has decided that a wrong answer given fast is worse than a right answer given slow. "How long?" he said. "The first time. Minutes. And since. Every time I am near her." He nodded. He was still watching the young wolf. She had paused at the north corner of the yard and was looking at something I could not see. "When the harbor goes to slack tide," he said, "it is not because the water has stopped. It is because the two currents, the incoming and the outgoing, are equal. For a moment, exactly balanced. What feels like stillness is actually two things in perfect proportion." I waited. "Your wolf has been one current," he said, "moving, looking, pulling in a direction." He finally looked at me. "She is the other current." I sat with this for a moment. "You could have said that more directly," I said. "I could have," he said. He did not apologize. I looked at the young wolf in the yard. She had gone to the north corner and was lying down, nose pointed at whatever she was watching that I couldn't see. Her tail moved slowly. "The council will not accept it," I said. "The council," Aldrich said, with the tone of a man who has watched councils be wrong for 30 years, "will accept what you decide." It was not, of course, that simple. Caston came to me 2 days later with a petition signed by 7 of the Harbor Guild masters. The petition made no direct mention of Myra. Caston was not so clumsy as that, but its subject was clear. The Ironmere match should be concluded. The delegation had been patient. Lord Caston's position at the dock levies was contingent on the goodwill of the Ironmere fleet, and the king's apparent reluctance to proceed was causing uncertainty in the harbor trading community. I read the petition in the council chamber with 6 of my council present. Lord Caston stood at the far end of the table looking like a man who has placed a bet and is watching the odds. "The king's apparent reluctance," I read aloud. "It is, of course, phrased diplomatically," Caston said. "It is phrased," I said, "as if my reluctance requires accounting for." Caston met my eyes, which he could usually do with confidence. He was a large man, wide-shouldered, with the authority of someone who has spent decades being the most important person in most rooms. He was not the most important person in this room. "The Ironmere fleet represents 1/3 of the harbor's inbound cargo volume," he said. "Lady Issen's family controls 4 tidal gate licenses. Any disruption—" "I am aware of what Lady Issen's family controls," I said. "I know these numbers better than anyone in this room." I set the petition down. "The match is not concluded. It may not be concluded. The decision is mine." Caston absorbed this with the stillness of a man who is recalculating. "If your Majesty has a reason for the delay," he said carefully, "it would ease the council's." "The council's ease," I said, "is not a factor I weigh against the kingdom's interest." This ended the meeting. Caston left with his petition and the expression of a man who had expected one kind of game and found another. The harbor wolves were at her stall. There were 3 of them, all from the lower district pack, the animals that had lived in the breakwater caves since before my father's time and that belonged to no one's authority, including mine. They answered to their own hierarchy. They tolerated human proximity in the way that suited them, which was to say, when it suited them and not otherwise. I came around the south end of the market on the 7th morning and stopped. The 3 wolves were arranged in a loose cluster at the base of Myra's stall. One was lying with his head on his forepaws. One was sitting upright, facing outward, watching the key with the alert attention of a posted guard. The 3rd was asleep, which wolves rarely do in public spaces in daylight. Myra was working. She had not, as far as I could tell, arranged for this to happen. She was not doing anything to encourage it. The wolves were simply there, and she was simply there, and neither of them seemed to find the other's presence remarkable. A cluster of guild wives had stopped on the near side of the market lane, and were watching with the specific tight-lipped attention of people who are storing this observation for later use. I recognized 2 of them, the wife of the master rope walker and the wife of the Eastern Dock crane supervisor. Both of them had opinions about bloodlines and standing. Both of them had been vocal, in the way of Harbor Guild wives, about Lady Issen's suitability. "The lower pack doesn't sleep in the market," said a voice near me. I turned. It was Delara, my harbor registry officer, who had come up beside me with a manifest in one hand and the expression of someone who had been watching things for years and finally had a new thing to watch. "They haven't done that in." "I know," I said. "It is worth noting," she said carefully, "that the last time the lower pack settled near a person, it was your grandmother. Your grandmother," she did not need to add, "had been the Luna of Valdenmere." I looked at the wolves. The one facing outward turned his head briefly in my direction. His eyes were amber. He held my gaze for a moment in the way of a wolf who is acknowledging something, and then returned to watching the key. My wolf was doing the slack-tied thing again. "Delara," I said. "Your Majesty." "Who else has noticed?" She considered this. Everyone who has walked through the south end of the market this morning. I nodded. I walked to the stall. Myra looked up when she heard my step change. She had learned by then to distinguish my step from others, which I was not sure whether to find remarkable or simply characteristic of someone who pays close attention to things. She looked at me, then at the wolves, then back at me. "You know them," she said. "They belong to the lower district pack," I said. "They don't belong to anyone precisely." "They arrived this morning," she said. "Before the market opened. I didn't feed them anything." She said this last part with the slightly defensive note of someone who is aware that feeding wild harbor wolves is technically discouraged by the harbor regulations. "I know," I said. "That's not why they're here." She looked at me steadily. "Why are they here?" I looked at her. I had been, for some days, moving toward a conversation I did not know how to begin, because there are not, in the whole library of how kings speak to people, many templates for. The wolves of my harbor have noticed something about you that I have also noticed, and which I believe is the most important thing that has happened to me in 18 years of rule. This is not a sentence that comes easily to a man who has spent 18 years being careful and correct, and keeping the harbor running and the levees honest, and the tidal gates in good repair. But she was looking at me with those gray eyes that did not flicker, and the wolves were there, and the guild wives were watching from 30 feet away with their tight-lipped observation, and Caston was filing petitions, and somewhere at the dock gates the iron seal that had not spoken in 200 years was, I would learn this within the hour, already preparing its opinion. "Because," I said, "they know something I should have told you already." She waited. She was very good at waiting. "My name is Rowan," I said. "You know that, but my full name is Rowan, King of Valdenmere." I watched her face. "The man you mended on the quay at the 4th hour was the same man." She looked at me for a long moment. I could see her processing this, not in shock exactly, but in the careful way of someone who is reordering what they knew. "The wool coat," she said. "I keep it in the stable chest." "You do the patrols yourself." I believe a king who only knows his harbor from reports does not know his harbor. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, with the same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of someone who has examined a problem and reached a conclusion, "That's a reasonable position." I almost laughed. I have not almost laughed in a council chamber in 18 years. "Myra," I said. "Yes. I need to tell you something else." I told her about my wolf. I told her about the slack tide. I told her that Aldrich had put words to what I had felt, and that I had spent a week arguing with myself about whether there was any reading of the evidence other than the one that I feared was true simply, because it was also the one I most wanted to be true. I told her that the harbor wolves were not there by coincidence. I told her that I had never, in 18 years of running this kingdom, felt in a council room the particular quality of stillness that I had felt standing at the edge of her stall watching her work. She listened to all of this without interrupting. Her hands were still in her lap. She was looking at me with the steady attention of someone who is not going to make a decision until she has heard everything, and who is not afraid of what she might hear. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You believe this," she said, "not a question." "Yes." "Not as a king who wants something from a dockside seamstress," she said. Also not a question. She was making sure I understood the shape of what she was asking. "I was a man in a wool coat when I met you," I said. "You mended me and asked nothing. Whatever I want it for the same reason the wolves are here. Not because of who I am, because of who you are." She looked at the wolves. The one with the amber eyes turned to look at her briefly and then looked away. And if a wolf can communicate through the quality of its indifference that the point has already been decided and the humans are simply catching up, that wolf did so. "I don't know anything about being a Luna," she said. Neither did my grandmother when she took the harbor registry job, I said. She learned the tidal gates by the end of her first year. She was better at them than anyone we'd had before. Myra looked at me for a long moment with those eyes that missed nothing. You researched that? I asked Aldrich, I said. It seemed relevant. Something in her expression shifted. Not the small adjustment of registration, something warmer. Something that had not been there the morning on the quay when she had bound my side and told me to hold still, or had been there, but had not yet known what it was for. I need to think, she said. Yes, I said. Not because I doubt you, she said, because thinking is what I do before I make decisions. It's how I'm made. I know, I said, I meant it. It was one of the things I found. There was no other word. Admirable. Take whatever time you need. I left the stall. The wolf with the amber eyes watched me go with what I chose to interpret as approval. I was halfway up the quay when the sound reached me. It was a low, clear tone, resonant and iron deep, the kind of sound that moves through stone and rope and salt air alike. It came from the direction of the dock gates. It was the iron seal, the seal that marked the threshold of Valdenmere's harbor, old iron, 200 years old, mounted in the stone arch above the main gate, carved with the device of the founding Luna and set there by her own hand. It was said to ring only when what had been bound at the kingdom's founding was confirmed again in the present. It had not rung in my lifetime. It had not rung in my father's lifetime. It rang for 30 seconds and then went quiet. I stood on the quay and listened to it ring. Behind me, I knew without turning, Myra had heard it. The guild wives had heard it. The rope walkers on the North Quay had heard it. The pilot standing in the tidal gate tower had heard it. The whole harbor had heard it. My wolf was no longer at slack tide. He was, I felt this distinctly, completely quiet, in the way that is different from stillness, the quietness of something that has arrived. Caston moved on the third day after the seal rang. I will give him this. He was not a small man in his ambitions or his speed. He understood that the seal's ringing had changed things, had changed them publicly, irreversibly, in the hearing of 300 people on the lower quay. And he understood that whatever he was going to do, he needed to do it before the implications fully settled. What he did was this. He invoked the harbor master's authority over the lower market and issued a clearance order for the south end of the quay. The order cited the Ironmere fleet's incoming visit and the need to expand the docking area. The south end of the market, which contained Myra's stall along with 11 others, was to be cleared within 2 days. He had technically the authority to do this. The harbor master's clearance powers were real, and he held the harbor master's proxy. What he did not have was the right to use those powers to resolve a personal political situation. But the order was issued before I saw it, and by the time Delara brought it to me, Myra had already received notice. I found her at the stall. She was not packing. She was working because, as I have established, Myra's response to difficulty is to continue doing the thing that needs doing. But there was a flatness to her expression that I had not seen before. The order, she said when I arrived. I know, I said. It's signed by the harbor master's proxy. Caston. She looked at me. Is this because of, she did not finish the sentence, she did not need to. Yes, I said, it is. And it is not going to stand. I had come, for the first time since the morning on the quay, in more than a wool coat. I had not brought the crown that would come, but I had come in the heavy gray coat with the harbor seal on the collar, the one that everyone in this city knew, and I had come with Delara and with Aldrich and with the 2 senior council members who had, in the last 3 days, been watching Caston's maneuvers with increasing skepticism. The lower quay was not empty. Word travels fast in a harbor. There were rope walkers and dock hands and gate pilots and market traders, and, at the far edge of the gathering, the rigid posture of the guild wives who had been storing observations for days, and were now watching to see what they would be used for. At the dock gate arch, the iron seal was silent but had the quality, in the early morning light, of something that had recently spoken and had not yet returned to rest. Caston was there. He had come to oversee the clearance. I think he had expected to find an empty stall, or at least a confused and frightened woman who did not know the political geography she was standing in. He found, instead, Myra working calmly on a bolt of canvas, the lower pack wolves arranged at the foot of the stall with the studied indifference of animals that have decided the question and are waiting for the humans to catch up, and me walking toward him across the lower quay in the harbor seal coat. His face went through several expressions quickly. He settled on a dignified version of standing his ground. "Your Majesty," he said, "the clearance order." "Is revoked," I said. "The harbor master's proxy." "The harbor master's proxy," I said, "is exercised at the council's discretion. The council's discretion has been revised." I handed him the paper Delara had prepared that morning. He took it and read it with the expression of a man who is reading something he has been afraid of. "The dock levy authority," he said, "is being reassigned to the registry office pending a review of how it has been used," I said. "Delara will supervise the review." He looked up, the Ironmere match. "Lady Issen will receive a letter today," I said, expressing Valdenmere's continued respect for the Ironmere fleet's trading position and explicitly declining the match. "I have written to Lady Issen's family directly. They will understand. They are, in my experience, practical people who trade in facts, and the facts have changed." The harbor was very quiet. Harbor spaces are rarely quiet. There is always a crane, a gate, a rope line, a hull, but the lower quay had gone to that particular stillness that large gatherings achieve when they are collectively holding their attention in one direction. Caston looked at the revocation paper. He looked at me. He was a man who had spent 30 years building a position in this city, and he had the composure, I will admit, to face the ruin of it without flinching visibly. "I have served this harbor for 30 years, he said. "You have," I said. "That service is on the record and will remain there. The abuse of the clearance authority is also on the record. You will leave Valdenmere within the week. Where you go is your business. The harbor registry will provide references for your 30 years of prior service. The last 3 days are not in them." He handed the paper back to me. He walked away up the quay. He did not look back, which I thought was the most dignity the situation permitted, and I gave him credit for it. I turned to Myra. The wolves, all 3 of them, were on their feet now. The amber-eyed one was standing directly beside her, not quite touching, in the way of a wolf that has made a judgment about proximity and does not intend to be argued out of it. I walked to her stall. The harbor watched. "Myra," I said. "Rowan," she said. Her voice had the quality it always had, level, without performance. "I should have done this more quietly," I said. "You did what needed doing," she said. "That's what you do." "Yes," I said, "it's also what you do." She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the amber-eyed wolf, who looked back at her with the expression of an animal that has been waiting for this particular moment and finds it satisfactory. "I thought about it," she said. "I know. I thought about it for 3 days. 3 days is enough time," I said. "It is," she said, "if you're thorough." She set down the canvas she'd been holding. "I should tell you that I'm not going to be good at courts," she said. "I'll learn what I need to learn, but I don't perform things. I don't know how to be in a room and mean something different from what I say." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here." "You need someone who means what they say." "More than almost anything else," I said. "In a harbor kingdom, the thing that ruins everything every time is someone who says one thing and means another. A manifest that doesn't match the cargo. A levy declared and then altered. A match agreed and then used for something else." I was aware that I had moved from metaphor into something more direct. I have been surrounded for 18 years by people who manage their words the way they manage their inventories, carefully, with an eye to advantage. You told a bleeding stranger to hold still. You told him your price for wound mending was nothing because it was available to be done. You told me my name suited me because you'd noticed I didn't mind cold weather. She was looking at me steadily. I need someone who will tell me to hold still, I said. Something moved in her expression, the shift that was warmer than adjustment, the thing I had seen beginning at the stall 3 days ago. She reached out and took my hand. It was the straightforward gesture of someone who has examined the question from all angles and has reached a conclusion. The iron seal rang. One tone, clear and resonant, moving through the stone arch and out across the harbor and up the quay and into the air above the lower market, where the guild wives and the rope walkers and the gate pilots and everyone else in the harbor of Valdenmere stood and heard it. The amber-eyed wolf sat down with the satisfied air of an animal who has been proven right. My wolf, the one who had been one current seeking another, who had gone to slack tide the morning on the quay, who had arrived so completely 3 days ago that I had not had a single restless hour since, was still. Not slack tide still, arrived still. We were married at the winter solstice. Not a hasty ceremony. Myra is not a hasty person, and I am, despite what the council has occasionally suggested, capable of patience when patience is the right tool. We were married at the winter solstice in the great hall of the harbor palace, which has a view of the lower quay from the east windows if you stand at the right angle, and the harbor was lit with the solstice lanterns, and the iron seal above the dock gate arch could be seen from those windows, catching the lantern light. The guild wives were in attendance. Myra had not invited them, but neither had she excluded them, because she is not a woman who organizes her life around scores to settle. They attended. They saw the ceremony. The one who had been loudest about bloodlines and standing stood at the back of the hall and was quiet throughout. Lady Issen sent a gift, a bolt of very fine deep-water wool, with a note that was both gracious and precise, the note of someone who is genuinely practical and wished us well without sentimentality. I had been right about the Ironmere family. They traded in facts, and they had adjusted to the facts. The lower pack wolves attended the ceremony in the way that wolves attend ceremonies, which is to say, they did not come inside, but they were on the quay below the east windows, visible in the solstice lantern light, and the amber-eyed one sat at the dock gate arch from the beginning of the ceremony until the end. Aldrich, standing beside me before the ceremony began, looked out the east windows at the wolves on the quay and said, "They've never done that before either." "I know," I said. 30 years, he said. "I've never seen the lower pack hold position for a ceremony." "She doesn't do anything to encourage them," I said. "She doesn't have to," he said. He watched the amber-eyed wolf at the gate arch. "Your grandmother's wolf used to say that a true Luna doesn't gather a pack. The pack gathers to a true Luna." I looked out at the quay, at the wolves in the lantern light, at the iron seal above the arch, which was, in the light of 30 solstice lanterns, simply an iron seal on a stone arch, patient, old, already said what it needed to say. I said, my grandmother's wolf was right. That was 4 years ago. Myra learned the tidal gates in her first year. She learned them the way she learned everything, by asking questions that were so precise they occasionally made my harbor pilots' heads hurt, and by reading the original survey documents from my grandmother's time, which no one else had read in a generation, and by walking every quay at every hour until she knew the routes the way she knew the routes to the early market, her feet knowing before her mind had to instruct them. She is not good at courts, as she predicted. She does not perform things. When the Ironmere delegation visits, as they do twice yearly now, the match dissolved but the trading relationship intact, which is what actually mattered. Lady Issen and Myra have developed, to everyone's mild surprise, a corresponding relationship built on the shared quality of saying what they mean. They are not friends in the sense that harbor guild wives understand friendship. They are something more useful than that. The council has, over 4 years, reached its accommodation with the reality of who their Luna is. Some of them reached it because they saw the wolves. Some because they watched her work the tidal gate manifests and realized she was better at catching discrepancies than anyone they'd had before. Some, the ones I trust most, the ones who are worth having in a council room, reached it simply because they watched her and understood. Caston has not returned to Valdenmere. I do not know where he is, and I do not keep track. The harbor wolves are still at the stall. Myra still keeps the stall, 3 boards at the south end of the lower market, bolts of linen and canvas arranged by weight and weave. She does not keep it every day, and she does not keep it alone anymore. She has an apprentice, a young woman from the rope walkers district who has her own talent for the economy of motion, and whom Myra has the patience to teach. But she keeps it often enough that it is still hers, and the wolves are still there, and the people of the lower key still bring their coats and their questions, and occasionally their wounds, and Myra still mends what needs mending without charging for what was available to be done. I go there when I can. I go in the harbor seal coat now, not the wool one, because there is no longer any point in the wool one. Everyone in Valdenmere knows who the man at the south end of the lower market is. I stand at the edge of the stall and watch her work, and my wolf is still, and everything in me that has spent 18 years moving and calculating and planning is, for the length of time I am there, perfectly at rest. She told me once in the first month after the wedding that she had known something was different the morning on the quay when she mended the wound. Not about me, specifically. She had not known who I was, but about the work. She had mended many wounds on the quay at early hours because there are a lot of dockworkers and not enough healers, and she had done it well each time, efficiently, with the right application of tallow salve and clean linen. But this time, and she said this with the precision that characterizes everything she says, looking for the right word and waiting until she found it, this time, after she had said hold still and he had held still, she had felt that the instructions and the compliance had been exactly balanced, equal weight. Like a tide gate, exactly calibrated to the harbor's level. I told her about slack tide, about the 2 currents finding each other. She said yes like that. There is an evening bell in Valdenmere Harbor. It rings at the 4th hour past midday, when the tide turns, not dramatic, not the iron seal, just the practical bell in the gate tower that tells the pilots where they are in the tidal cycle. It has rung every day for 200 years. I have listened to it for 18 years. For 18 years it marked the hour and nothing else. Now when I hear it, and I hear it every day, wherever I am in the harbor, because the bell tower was built to carry, and it does, I hear it and I think of her voice saying hold still. Not because the memory is sentimental, because it is precise. Because she said it to a bleeding man she did not know at the 4th hour of morning, and meant it entirely, and the man held still, and everything that came after came from that. The tide bell rings. I hold still. I find that, with her, holding still is the easiest thing I have ever done.